lies the crown. All right, welcome to our next session of the Christian History Summer Session. And this is going to be the last one, because I've got classes and stuff now. I started class, yeah.
Not that you have to do this.
No, I really enjoy doing this, but unfortunately I'm going to be very busy doing other stuff the rest of the fall. Oh, yes. Is that, did I get it? All right. Yes, yes. We went from 2 to 5 in 24 hours last week. Good news, bad news. Like, there's a little bit up there. We went from, drought to flood in overnight, so that was a little wild. But hooray, there will in fact be classes, and way too many of them, unfortunately, for me to continue the study for the time being. The plan is we're going to do the second half in the spring, but that will, again, be subject to my schedule and everything else that's going on. So today's it. We're going to get to the Renaissance, and we're going to take a break, and that break will be indefinitely long, and then we'll go forward and talk about the Reformation and all the crazy stuff that happens after that, which is a lot. So,
In January.
yes, okay, January. I will plan on that. I probably, yeah. Let's not plan on anything after the next 3 months. Like, there's just way too much up in the air at this point. But ostensibly, January, spring, that's the plan. But enough about the bureaucracy. Let's actually talk about the history. So when we left off last time in our rapid fire cover of like 400 years of Christian history, we kind of closed with the big reforms that were coming up through the monasteries. The papacy being radically reformed, the whole move towards celibacy, and so on and so forth. And we also talked about the Crusades, and that's actually where I want to pick up right now. You'll remember in the Third Crusade, I told the frankly hilarious story of Frederick Barbarossa taking a bath and dying while in the middle of his crusade. Well, he was the Holy Roman Emperor at the time, which means there were some fairly major political kerfuffles to come about as a result of this particular wild tragedy. Specifically, his death coincided at almost the exact same time with the death of the Pope, which turned out to be super convenient for the Pope, because now there wasn't a Holy Roman Emperor looking over the Pope's shoulder and all the cardinals' shoulders as they were choosing the new Pope. So the Pope who got elected without any influence from the Holy Roman Empire, which was a giant political mess at the moment, was Pope Innocent III. And this guy is probably the single most powerful pope in the entire history of the papacy. This is it, folks, the peak of papal power. It's all going to be downhill from here. But Pope Innocent III quickly maneuvers himself into the most powerful figure in all of Europe. Frederick Barbarossa's son, who is also named Frederick, is too young to ascend to the throne at this point in time. So Pope Innocent sort of adopts Frederick as his ward and takes personal responsibility for his protection, while somebody else takes the Holy Roman Empire throne. Eventually, Pope Innocent manages to maneuver that person into interdict and gets him kicked out of the throne, so his little protected ward, Frederick, can ascend to the throne, and now Pope Innocent basically controls the Holy Roman Empire. Additionally, at the same time, he has fingers in every pie in Europe. There are some great stories of like King Philip in France divorcing his wife and taking up with a new wife, and Innocent being like, "You can't do that!" and forcing them to get back together, which made both of them miserable according to like all historical accounts. He's the guy who told John Lackland to get his stuff together, and thus John Lackland was also under interdict, and his people rose up and made him sign the Magna Carta. So Pope Innocent is like directly responsible for major things happening in Europe, all over Europe at this point. And during Pope Innocent's reign, we get the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215, towards the end of his rule. And in the Fourth Lateran Council, this is basically Pope Innocent just doing everything he wants to do and not having any opposition to it. So there are tons of reforms to the Catholic Church that happened during this one council because literally no one is standing against this guy at this point. This is the advantage of a Republican president and a Republican Congress, basically. So the first one on the docket is transubstantiation. This is now official. We've talked about transubstantiation a little bit. This was the major idea that the monks were kicking around for the last few hundred years. Now it is formally the doctrine of the Eucharist in the Catholic Church, officially. We also get a rash of condemnations. There are a couple of heresies that have cropped up in the past 100, 200 years. Specifically that of Joachim of Fiore, who had some major eschatological things to say. His whole platform was apparently that, like, in the 1250s, there was going to be this radical change in the way that God ruled the universe. But, like, originally there was the age of God the Father, and then there was the age of God the Son, and this is the transition to the age of God the Holy Spirit. And there are a whole bunch of monks who were, like, waiting for all sorts of apocalyptic signs to take place and big changes to happen in the church. And anytime something even remotely large did happen, they would, like, lose their minds and immediately think this was it, this was the end, this is the sign that everything's going to change. We also have the Albigensians and the Waldensians. We're not going to spend a lot of time on Waldo, but the Albigensians we are going to come back to. We also get a rule from Innocent that there are not going to be any more random monastic orders running around. One of the products of the Crusades was there were a whole bunch of monastic orders that were basically given weapons and told, hey, you have a vow of poverty, you're going to live a holy life. You're also going to fight for the church in the Holy Land. This is where we get the Templars, for example, or the Hospitaliers. But there are a whole bunch of random monks who are basically like taking up arms and saying, we're a monastic order, and then just going around causing mayhem. So Innocent draws the line. Nope, no more new monastic orders. Which is actually really ironic because the two most famous monastic orders will come about after this order, so oops. We also get the announcing of the beginning of the Inquisition. From now on, all priests and bishops are going to be responsible for rooting out heresy and destroying it in all of their parishes. This will have consequences, although it's not a huge deal at this moment in time. Also, on a more light-hearted note, at this point the cathedrals have been gradually building their own schools. Churches that are at the center of the diocese, they're getting more money to build bigger institutions, big cathedrals. This is not yet like the big Gothic cathedrals. This is the moment in time where those Gothic cathedrals are starting to be constructed, where they're becoming a big thing in their own right. But it's primarily after this that they become so important. But by announcing that the cathedrals are now going to host schools, and those schools are going to specifically be geared towards educating the poor, the cathedrals now become a huge center of intellectual and spiritual life. And that's why all of this money is going to start getting funneled into building big Gothic edifices like Notre Dame de Paris or the other major cathedrals of this period. But it is really cool that he is opening them to the poor. No longer is the realm of education just reserved to the monks, the clergy, the priesthood, etc., etc. Now there are poor people being taught how to read, which is going to tie into major changes in the economy and the society as we go forward. We also get, on a slightly negative note, we're going to make Jews and Muslims in the Christian world wear specific clothes to distinguish them from everybody else. Yeah, anti-Semitism is running rampant at this point in time. You'll remember when we talked about the Crusades frequently, like as you are going off to the Holy Land, you will ransack your local synagogue while you are on the way, because nobody protects the Jews. The church really did not care for them at this point in time. Judaism at this point was associated in Europe with usury, the practice of lending money on interest, which was considered a mortal sin and a grievous crime. The Jews had also received restrictions about usury to each other, but not to Christians. So as a result, the Jews had become the bankers of Christendom at this point in time, and because nobody likes their banker when they come and demand payments on their loan, it was pretty frequent that you would default on your loan by ransacking the local Jewish community. And this worked its way into the church as well. So now there is a great deal of anti-Semitism going on, and it's only going to get worse over the course of this lecture, I'm afraid, and it will only get worse from here. But again, the fact that this is part of the official church platform at this point, that this is the sort of like horrible, starting changes that we see in fascist governments as well. Keep in mind, this is not all good news, Pope Innocent's platform. But what I want to stress about the Fourth Lateran Council is it is like the shortest council in history. 3 days it took to pass all of that and more, which is, again, what you get when a pope that is completely unopposed by any political force in Europe or even the cardinals can basically just push all of his legislation through and nobody can say a word about it. That's how much power he wielded at this point. And he probably had a huge amount of influence on theology and on the growth of the church for all these reasons, and again, lots that I didn't talk about, because he was in the right place at the right time, had the power, could wield it, and nobody could speak against him. And again, there are good things on this list, like opening the schools to the poor. There are bad things on this list, like Jewish and Muslim clothing restrictions. Power can be used for good or evil within the church, but when it's unchecked, there's no check to it. There's no way of, preventing the bad. It just comes in with the good. Now, at the same time as this is happening, like right after the Fourth Lateran Council, this marks the beginning of the end for papal power in Europe. Like, this is the peak, and the fall is pretty rapid from this point in time. Within 50 years, we're going to have Boniface, one of the many Bonifaces, I think it's Boniface VII, who assumes great power and then can't wield it. One of the things that happens at the Fourth Lateran Council that I didn't mention so much is a lot of the Pope's supporters argue that the papal authority stands above all secular authority. That because the Pope is in direct service to Christ, the King of this world, therefore he wields authority over all kings and all princes and all secular lords. Obviously, those secular lords didn't take kindly to that sort of argument. So when Boniface VII later basically starts bossing all of these kings and lords around, they start pushing back. And what we will end up with is a huge change in the way that the Pope and the papacy are viewed. But we'll get there. In the meantime, we need to talk about change that's going on in the church itself. We need to talk about the mendicant monks. At the same time as papal power is increasing and it's starting to coalesce and become this sort of, huge Christian empire in its own right, the monks, as usual, are resisting this. They refuse to accept this new honor, power, and authority that's sort of gathering around Christendom. You will notice every time we have talked about Christianity grows more powerful, the monks usually react and become weaker. The response in this case is there are a whole bunch of mendicant orders, monks who declare themselves a vow of poverty and refuse all power and secular authority, who deliberately oppose the will of the papacy, not by saying you are wrong, but rather by living a different example. The first of the two major orders that come out of this movement is the Dominicans. The Dominicans, founded by St. Dominic, pictured here on the left, are primarily founded to combat the Albigensian heresy. The Albigensians are kind of the new cool version of Gnosticism. Once again, we've got a dualistic way of looking at the universe. We've got secret knowledge and hidden information. It looks a lot like Gnosticism, even if the specific gods and names are changed a little bit. This is round 3 for Gnosticism for those of you playing along at home, possibly round 4, depending on who you're counting. But the Dominicans are founded to fight against the Albigensians. They're going to stand in opposition to them. It is not necessarily a violent order, but mostly an ideological order. We're going to stand up and proclaim the truth of the gospel, the Christian Orthodox beliefs. We're going to scholarly approach this subject, and therefore all these Albigensians who seem to be super smart are going to be faced with a bunch of Dominicans who also are super smart, but actually are defending Catholicism proper. And as a result, they have this emphasis on poverty, opposed to the Albigensians and to the Pope for that matter, but also on scholarship. The thing that you will see the Dominicans doing more often than not, writing treatises, delivering lectures, and being really intelligent. They're also balancing that with the same holy life that we've seen in the Benedictine rule. The monks are based on the Benedictine model, so they still have the same rules, but now instead the focus is on the scholarship rather than on the manual labor and other things that Benedict suggested. And since this is the exact same time when universities are springing up all over Europe, secular universities brought about by people from the now growing middle class, as well as lords and kings founding their own realms of scholarship, the Dominicans actually get adopted by universities pretty quickly. The Dominicans in the university system very much have many of the same goals in mind, so a lot of Dominicans become university professors. Now at this point, the major universities to keep an eye on are Paris and Oxford. Those are like some of the oldest. There are others that are getting founded all the time during this period, but those are the two that we may have occasion to come back to in the future. So keep an eye out on those. Now the other order we definitely need to talk about, and the other like most famous of the mendicant orders, are the Franciscans. And you have probably heard of the Franciscans, and if not, congratulations, this is your opportunity because they're actually really cool. The Franciscans were founded by this guy with the sheep, St. Francis of Assisi. And St. Francis of Assisi is probably one of the saints who most deserves the title. He famously insisted on poverty overall. The goal of his order was to not make any concessions to the wealth and the power that was sort of like taking up the Catholic Church at this point. Now it is just poverty that he wants to emphasize. He will less emphasize the scholarship the way that the Dominicans do. He's not as interested in sort of like the manual labor and stuff. Instead, he is focused 100% on keeping his monks honest and holy through poverty. Now, St. Francis has like a lot of stories crop up about him, so the reason why he's pictured here and in most like pictures of St. Francis, you'll see him surrounded by birds. Apparently he talked to birds. That was one of the legends that sort of sprang up around him. Most of the saints have like miracles attributed to them. That's actually one of the prerequisites that the Catholic Church uses in the process of canonization, like are there any miracles associated with the saint? Francis is frequently associated with talking to animals, birds, sheep, other things like that. He was also famous for just being kind, like where so many of these various major Catholic figures at this time, like the popes, at this moment of their really impressive power, they're sort of hypocrites and they're sort of perceived as being like schemers or politicers. Francis was not. Francis deliberately avoided all of that, sidestepped the whole process. Now, surprise, his model of poverty didn't stick around for too long. Shortly after his death, and like on his deathbed, he wrote a letter saying like, poverty guys, poverty for real, we're not gonna have money. Very quickly after his death, there was a division amongst the Franciscan monks between a group called the rigorists, or the spiritualists, on the one hand, and the moderates on the other. The rigorists wanted to insist on Francis's really hard restrictions on having wealth and property. The moderates were more interested in saying like, well, we can have some property. Like, we don't have to have, no property. Francis was like, I'm giving my bowl away to people because I don't need it anymore. Like, he took off his clothes and gave them to a bishop at one point because he didn't think he should own them. Now we have Franciscans saying, well, we could own our own monastery, right? Like, there's nothing wrong with that. We gotta have a place to be. And there's a number of different, like, tricksy ways that this sort of got negotiated around. Like, at one point, the Catholic Church says, you know what, tell you what, we're gonna loan you this monastery. Like, the whole property, all the grounds, you are welcome to, you won't own it. We're gonna own it. But you can just use it. Like, you can use it all the time. And some people are okay with this, and the spiritualists are like, no, this is obviously like just, an elaborate dodge. The spiritualists, surprise, surprise, lose this fight and eventually get excommunicated from the order. The moderates win the day. So to this day, the Franciscans are allowed to own some property, some land, some stuff. And I suspect that Francis is probably turning over in his grave even now as a result. But the other thing that we need to talk about as far as like the monks and the way that the world is changing is the theological development here. This is probably one of the richest moments in all of theological history, like short of the Reformation and some of the big changes that happen as a result. Scholasticism is the highest moment of inquiry in the entire Middle Ages. And it produces some of the greatest minds that the church has ever seen. This is primarily during like the 13th and 14th century, late in this process. But again, there are a lot of different factors that have sort of contributed to this development and to this new spirit of inquiry. The first is what we've talked about before, Anselm of Canterbury. We talked about his ontological argument last time, and we talked about how like reason and revelation work together in Anselm's structure. But today I want to talk about the other thing that Anselm of Canterbury is especially famous for. He is the one to first and most thoroughly articulate the theory of substitutionary atonement. And I know that those are big fancy words that probably don't mean much. Substitutionary atonement is the idea that the reason why we are saved, the whole justification process, is because Jesus gave his life to God in satiation of God's justice for the sake of our salvation. And I know that this is like, well, yeah, everybody believes that. They didn't, though. Up until this point, the idea of how salvation worked was usually worked around Jesus giving his life to Satan for payment for the debt that we owed to Satan, not God. The idea of this being to satisfy God's justice and not Satan's debt is fairly new. Like, people had kicked this idea around for a while. Some of the theologians we've talked about have, in fact, like, approached it from that angle, but no decisive, definitive statement had been made to say that, like, this is the policy. But weirdly, after Anselm articulates the substitutionary atonement theory, this becomes the dominant theory across the board. Like, no council, no big meeting to affirm that this is the case. Everyone before Anselm is undecided on the subject, or they're pretty much into the ransom theory. Everybody after Anselm, for some reason, just buys this. And that includes Catholics and Protestants. Like, this is not where the divide happens. The divide happens over something else. The theory of substitutionary atonement is the one that we all accept, and it's the one that virtually all Christians today accept, except maybe in the Eastern Orthodox Church, but I don't know the theology deeply enough there to be able to weigh in. At any rate, this is a sea change as far as how does salvation work. But the other thing that's the major factor in the development of scholasticism is Aristotle is now hitting the shelves. We talked last week about how the old texts of Aristotle were discovered in those Muslim libraries and are now getting translated for the first time into Latin. Now they're hitting the shelves in the monasteries, and the monks are starting to react to Aristotle. Aristotle is the hot new book that everyone is reading, and everybody has to deal with Aristotle in their theology and in their discussion about the Bible. And typically, this new Aristotelian information and philosophy makes everybody break into one of three camps. In the first camp, you have Bonaventure, this guy. Bonaventure is a hardcore Augustinian. He absolutely believes in what Augustine had to say. Augustine's whole Neoplatonic, like Plato plus religion project has been popular for all of medieval history. This is like the basis of everybody's theology, and it's just a matter of interpreting exactly how Augustine works. Bonaventure and others like him are hardcore Augustinians. They are not leaving behind the old traditional theology. Aristotle is new and fancy, and it has nothing to do with the Bible. We reject it outright. By contrast, we have guys like Siger of Brabant who say, let's get rid of Augustine and the whole old tradition, and let's adopt Aristotle, and let's take him and make new inquiries into how Aristotle can work with the Christian church, because this guy is probably the most knowledgeable proto-scientist that's ever lived. So with that in mind, there are all of these extreme Aristotelians who are arguing, let's take Aristotle, let's start with him, and then build our theology around him. This does not become a very popular position, and most of these guys get very much cast out of the church or lambasted across the board. But if you manage to hit the middle, a lot of cool stuff happens. So the obvious candidate here, and one that I want to talk about the most, is Thomas Aquinas, because he is, without a doubt, like the greatest theologian of this moment in history. I spent an entire semester studying him, just like I did Augustine before him. He is a big deal, and he's a really cool dude, and his theology is the foundation on which contemporary Catholicism is built. To this day, like in the 20th century, there's a whole new movement surrounding Thomas Aquinas and his philosophy and his theology in an attempt to develop it into more modern ways, because people think that he adapts well to the contemporary situation. These are the Neo-Thomists, and they've been active for the last 100 years and are probably the most important force in Catholic theology and philosophy today. So this guy's a big deal, and I want to spend a little bit of time on him. So the first thing I want to talk about with Aquinas is he articulates what will become the definitive way that reason and revelation are understood to work together. For Aquinas, reason is always right. But reason is always right because it is in line with revelation. It is also insufficient. There are things that we can't know given reason alone. We can look at the world, we can understand everything that Aristotle tells us, we can, look at plants and we can look at, the sky and we can come to conclusions and they are right. Science is a good thing to do, in short, though they're not talking about science at this point. But no matter how much of the world you understand, you're never going to come to conclusions like God gave his son to save us, or how justification works, or how salvation works. For that, we have to rely on revelation, which is a higher truth and a higher pursuit, like a higher realm of study. So he spends a lot of time in the Summa Theologica establishing the relationship between the two and talking about how they interact. But this is not an either-or situation for Aquinas. This is a both-and. What the testimony of our eyes and senses tell us is not at odds with what the Bible talks about. They are linked. It is one and the same truth. God is the same God, the same creator, the same person who does stuff in all of history and all of his products, be it the books that tell us what he thinks and what he says, or the world that is a literal product of his creative work. They are united. Which means he absolutely believes in the authority of the senses. His argument for the existence of God is going to take a form of trusting my senses, trusting the information that I get from looking at and examining the world. Again, they're not in opposition. The idea that they are in opposition is relatively new. Like, we're not going to talk about it today because it's not even going to happen today. We'll talk about that like in the 17th and 18th centuries when that becomes a big deal. So the way that he approaches the subject of how does God exist, how do you prove the existence of God, against Anselm and many other theologians to this point, who have said that like you can believe God because of what you feel or what God tells you, or because God's like provided his evidence in natural revelation. Aquinas leans on the natural revelation rather than the reason. Anselm, as you'll remember, says the ontological argument, God is the most perfect being that can be, therefore he must exist, because if he doesn't exist, that's imperfect. Aquinas rejects that. He says, yes, it's true, but we can't know it because we don't understand God's essence. Instead, his argument is, look out there, look at the world. Stuff that moves only moves because something else moves it. Therefore, everything that moves, and the fact is, stuff moves, must come from something that has moved it, and there must be something at the end of that chain that moves things but is not itself moved. A prime mover, to use Aristotle's term. And that is God for Aquinas. And he presents 5 different arguments structured on this same model. Here is something that we can observe in the world around us. It must have come from somewhere. There couldn't be an infinite regress, like you can't just go on forever and ever and ever with no direct cause. Therefore, the cause, the origin, the source is God. Now, we can know that there is a God based on our senses. We can't know exactly what he is like. That, for Aquinas, is the definitive distinction between natural revelation and Romans on the one hand, we know there is a God, versus what the Bible tells us. What is God like? We cannot deduce that God is good, loving, and merciful from looking at a tree, but we can know there must have been something that made the tree. That's basically his argument. Questions about this? Because I know this is highfalutin philosophy stuff. All right, keep pushing onward then. The other way that he really approaches this material, there is a lot of question in the scholastic world at this point about exactly what we can say about God. A lot of that comes from a guy, John of Damascus, who was several hundred years ago and was actually working under the Byzantines. But Aquinas is very interested in his argument because John Damascene says we can't say things like God is good or God is wise because the words we use for good and wise are based on our own limited understanding and they don't apply to the awesomeness that is God. John Damascene argues that we can only talk about what God is not. God is not like us. He is not evil like us. He is not stupid like us. Whatever he is, we can only dimly apprehend. Our minds are not up to it, so we cannot posit things about God. And Aquinas rejects this. His argument is that, yes, it's true that when I say that a person is good or an ice cream is good, that it's not the same as saying God is good. But there is enough similarity between the words good in both of these cases that they are analogical. They have similarity, but they are not one and the same term used in one and the same way. Likewise, if you say that a person is wise and that God is wise, it is very clear that the person is not wise in the same way that God is wise, but they are analogical. There is a similarity between them. So when we say things about God, that he is good, wise, strong, merciful, just, etc., that is like how we use the word normally, but not exactly the way it is used normally. It is not equivocal, it is not univocal, it is analogical. But I don't want to get too deep into that. That's not our stuff, and that's really like crazy stuff. The other thing that he stresses sort of against Augustine on the one hand, but also against the people who are opposing Augustine on the other, he stresses that God has a permissive will. You'll remember that when Augustine was talking about salvation and the whole discussion that came out around that, we had people on the one hand saying, like, God forces you to be a Christian. It is his irresistible grace that causes you to be saved. And you have nothing to do in that process. But people were coming back at Augustine and saying, okay, does that mean that God also predestines you to damnation? This is what is known as double predestination. And this was something that the church very vehemently resisted. No, God does not damn people. That's not how that works. God does not force you to become evil and therefore irredeemable. Aquinas causes this, or stresses the distinction between God's emphatic active will, the way that Augustine talks about it, and his permissive will, what God allows to happen. Which means that Aquinas is putting a premium on human free will in a way that Augustine simply didn't. But that means that now evil and sin and bad behavior can operate under the permissive will. God allows it, but God doesn't make you do it. You are not forced by God to be a sinner, which is like a clever way of bridging that particular theological divide. Though again, we can't like talk about it in terribly great detail. The last thinker that I want to talk about before we move on from scholasticism is a guy named William of Ockham. He comes around after Aquinas, like within the next 50 years, I want to say. And the primary thing that Occam is famous for is a principle known as Occam's razor, which you've probably heard of. According to Occam's razor, you shouldn't multiply causes. The simplest explanation is best. And this is another major theological principle that will ultimately become adopted by scientists down the road. If it isn't obvious, you can see the focus on Aristotelian philosophy bringing these scholastics closer and closer to what we understand as contemporary science. Guys like Aquinas with his emphasis on the senses and their reliability, guys like Occam trying to perfect method, this is the beginnings of what will one day be the scientific method. And again, I want to stress, the scientific method is, in its origin, Christian. Like, the idea that science and Christianity are opposed is relatively new and not terribly insightful, I suspect. But we'll get to that, obviously, in the second half of the class when we get to all that crazy stuff and the scientific method actually becomes something that we can talk about. Questions about any of the scholastics? Because I know that there's a lot going on here, and I'm sorry that I don't have more time to talk about it. Like, this is 2 weeks in my philosophy class, minimum. Then let's move forward. So, at the same time as all this crazy scholasticism is going on, at the same time as we've got like the papacy rising and falling, the world is changing, perhaps more dramatically than it has in at least 2 weeks of our class and a good 500 years, 600 years of history. Nations are starting to come together, is kind of the upshot here. One of the things you remember is the world itself, like physically, the forces involved have started to shift and move. Once upon a time, Europe was isolated. It was enemies on all sides. But now, Christendom, or Western Christendom, has conquered Constantinople, so we have a trading partner to our east. The Arabs have been pushed out of Spain, and they're actually getting friendlier. We tend to have more trade with the Arab Muslims than pure animosity, than as once was the case. So we have trading partners to the south. We missed Genghis Khan ripping through Russia and Eastern Europe, but now they're putting their stuff back together and the Khanate is considerably less threatening, so we have trading partners to our east. And now we have access to the rest of the world, which means the primary source of income at this point in time is no longer those estates that we talked about before. Feudalism is disintegrating. And in its place, we're seeing a lot of national identity. The French are getting their act together and becoming a nation under one king, a powerful entity in its own right, participating in global politics as a global power. Likewise, the Holy Roman Empire is trying to do the same thing and largely failing because it's not structured that way. And the Holy Roman Empire is on the brink of its long downhill fall. England has figured out it can be a nation, especially now that they've got this Magna Carta bringing the people together and seeing themselves as a common identifiable kingdom. And they are starting to identify and interact with the world at large. And this is happening all over the place. New powers are growing out of Europe, building empires in their own right, and being these sort of individual nations on this grand scale. People no longer identify with their petty lord as part of a greater kingdom, but rather as part of this nation. And there's good and bad about all of this, because these nations are, again, clashing up against each other all the time. The big war that we're going to be featuring in our discussion is the one between England and France, the 100 Years' War, which, P.S., if the name doesn't suggest, goes on for 100 years and is not terribly great for anybody involved. At the same time as this is all happening, though, we're also seeing the old royal lineages starting to actually lose power, because the trade is making people individually wealthy. There is now a middle class in Europe. There are secular, non-religious, non-national, non-aristocratic people who are getting rich off of the new situation. We are going from a feudal society to a mercantile society. Trade is now the most profitable thing that you can do. And because we have new centers of learning and the cathedrals are open to everyone, not just the clergy, because we have new sources of income from all over the place where individual citizens can get wealthy despite their situation, now power is moving. It is disseminating amongst people. It is disseminating amongst the nations, and it is disseminating amongst the people within those nations. And then right in the middle of this, the Black Death shows up. And I don't want to actually spend a whole lot of time on it. Like, I know when I went into my study, I was like, I need to focus on all those plagues, because like we've got some big plague stuff happening now, and we want to know how to deal with plagues. And the fact of the matter is, we did not handle the Black Death well. Like, as Christianity, it did not go well, as is often the case in these situations, and as is historically the case for the thousands of years before, and with all the plagues that have happened. When bad things show up, rather than helping each other, rich people tend to like close their walls and cut themselves off and refuse to acknowledge the plight of the people who are suffering. And that goes for the church as well. Monks close their doors, churches close their doors, and people die in the streets. Just to make matters worse, then, you know, all these people are dying and people are like, it's a judgment from God! Why does God hate us? And the answer was, it's because of the Jews. So we start killing the Jews. Good for us. If there is a lesson to be taken away from the way that the Christian church handled the Black Death, it is how not to do plague, and also how to warn yourself against what plagues cause people to do. The answer to, oh no, coronavirus is not, I'm going to protect me and mine, but rather the church going out and helping in any way that it can. So that's as much of a moral as I can offer at this point. There are stories of priests who like go out in the community, people who literally helped in any way that they could, people who ministered to the sick, but they are very much in the minority. The church policy, if there was one, was cover your butt. And that's not great, and not something I want to emphasize or promote, because I don't think it worked. The last thing that happened during this period that I do kind of want to touch on before we get too forward and move past it, Constantinople falls. in the late 15th century, which is kind of anticipating, but this is it. And I wanted to stress this because we did spend a good bit of time talking about the Byzantine Empire, and we talked about the Fourth Crusade and the conquest of Constantinople by, the Christian Crusaders who were supposed to be doing something completely different. Well, now the Arabs have pushed forward, the Turks have pushed into the Asia Minor, and they besiege the city of Constantinople, and it falls. And it will be under the control of Turkish rule for generations to come. That will be an enemy on the eastern border from now on. And the history going forward through the Renaissance, through the Reformation, and so on, is the Ottomans are always knocking at the door. They are frequently looking for an opportunity to invade Austria or the Balkans. Like, that's just what's going on. And that will hold until World War I. Like, the Ottoman Empire is the other major player in the Axis powers, or the Central Powers, in World War I. So that's a big deal, like, for Christendom and for Europe generally, but it's not, something we're going to be talking about especially much. This is just something that's going to be going on in the background. But what is going on in the foreground, what does radically change Christendom at this point in time, the papacy moves to Avignon in France. One of the major problems with this new paradigm is Italy has become the center of the world again. Because, once again, there's all this trade happening, and Italy is just sitting right there as the perfect series of ports, which means that all these people, like the Medicis, are getting rich off of all of this trade, and they're building their own empires, and they're getting into petty squabbles. Italy is one of those nations that is not going to become a nation during this period because there's too much money focused in too many small groups. So each of the Venetian city-states, Milan, Florence, Venice, Rome, they are all going to be in constant fights for the next 200 years until the Renaissance. They sign a peace treaty and everything goes smoothly for a little while. But as a result, the papacy is jeopardized. This constant fighting means that Rome is constantly under siege. It is constantly being battled for. There are all these ugly factions that are fighting for control of the papacy because that is yet again another power structure that can be manipulated by other forces in the region. So they move to France. But the bad news is when you are living under the landlord of the French king, you kind of have to do what he tells you to do. So weirdly, within 100 years of the most powerful pope who ever lived, is the line of the weakest popes who probably ever ruled. During the Avignon papacy, the popes are very much just the puppets of the French government. So whatever France says, the Pope kind of has to do because they are offering protection and power to the papacy and not the other way around. Which again, this is 60 years after, Boniface VII is like, Christ is the only power, we have direct influence from Christ, therefore we rule everyone. And everybody knows that this is bad. Like, the popes know this, the cardinals know this, everybody recognizes that they have been seriously devalued. And Christianity has a gun to its head at this point. It is not great. So, and one of the reasons why it's not great is because Christianity isn't universal anymore. If the French control the papacy, then the papacy cannot speak to enemies of the French. Which means, as we said, when this is going on at the same time as the 100 Years' War, when France is a constant enemy of England, that means that England is starting to see the papacy as an enemy. Likewise, the Holy Roman Empire, which has that long border with France and is constantly butting heads with them, they're starting to see the papacy as the enemy. For a good 50 to 60 years, the Pope becomes a political figure. And not in the sense that, I am the major figure in Christianity, therefore I am political, but in the sense of this is a political tool that France uses to get its job done. And that's ugly. So the papacy kind of chafes against this and is pushing back. And finally we get Gregory, I forget which number, unfortunately. Gregory the 11th. We're up to 11 Gregories at this point. Gregory the 11th says, okay, fine, we're done, we're going back to Rome. And he picks up the whole papal court and he goes to Rome. And it's only for a little while, it's only going to be for a couple of years. I mean, they own Rome, remember those forged documents we talked about? So this is like a safe place, they're just checking on the place, making sure, it doesn't get too messed up. And then, Avignon calls and they're like, hey Gregory, we wondered when you were coming back to Avignon so we can make you do more stuff. And Gregory is like, tell you what, after Easter, I'm going to come back and then everything will be fine. And then Gregory dies before Easter rolls around. So the cardinals have to all come to Rome and elect a new pope. But the people in Rome, of course, don't want a pope that is just a puppet manipulated by the Italians. So they get uppity, and they sort of besiege the cardinals as they're making their election, and the cardinals elect Urban VI, an Italian Catholic, someone who will rule from Rome. Which is good. Finally, they're out from under the thumb of the Avignon whole political situation. Except then the French and all the French cardinals come back to France. They're like, so we may have accidentally elected a pope. And the French king is like, dude, you need to fix that. Elect our own pope. So they do. They elect Clement VII, and he will rule in Avignon. So now we've got two popes, which is always a problem. One is a pope and one is anti-pope. But which one is which? But the major problem here, because we've had popes and anti-popes in the past, like you remember back in the 9th and 10th century when the papacy was a giant mess and people were like stabbing each other in the back and poisoning each other, and there was all this nepotism. Tons of anti-popes during that period of time, but never a huge, huge issue. The problem here is we built a new structure to elect popes. The cardinals are supposed to do it. So how does this go wrong? Well, it goes wrong when the cardinals elect two different people. So the same cardinals have decided on like who has the authority in this situation. So more and more the scuttlebutt is, well, if we elected them, then can't we like unelect them? What if we get a council of cardinals together and that actually technically can take out the popes and put a new one in its place? This is what's known as the conciliar movement. And the theology behind it is kind of gross and messy. The idea is if the cardinals give the pope power, then the cardinal should be able to take it away. But that's a radical distinction from what we've seen, again, as late as Innocent III. The pope is supposed to wield the supreme, unquestioned authority in the Catholic Church. The cardinals are supposed to be subservient to him, not turning on him. But this is kind of tying into the whole political theater right now. Like, this looks very Magna Carta. Your power comes from the people and not the other way around. So they are pushing, and they say, okay, you know what? We're going to declare our own council. We're going to fix this. We're going to get rid of the old popes. We're going to put a new one in. Specifically, we're going to elect Alexander V. So all the cardinals get together in Germany, and they say, all right, Alexander V is now the pope, and both of you other guys, Urban and Clement, you step down. They don't. They just sit there. And now we've got three popes. Count them, three popes. One of them is supposedly a real pope, and the other two are anti-popes. But now this is super political. The Italians totally support Urban VI. The French totally support Clement VII. And the British and the Spanish and the Germans, who are really grumpy at the French for holding on to the Pope for so long, are totally behind Alexander. So now it's just this big, ugly mess. And in the process, the papacy is losing a lot of credibility. If this is the kind of political ugliness that we can expect from Christianity and the papacy, then what good are the popes actually? Now at this point, all three of these popes die, and we get succession after succession of new popes taking over in each of these distinct sort of papal lines. So it's just becoming more and more complicated at every moment. Like who is in charge at any moment is completely ambiguous. So the cardinals all get together and they're going to do another council. The Council of Constance, not Constantine, that was an error on my part. We'll talk about the Council of Constance more because it'll be very relevant for some of the other stuff in a moment. But in 1414 they say, okay, all three of these popes are gone. We're going to do another pope instead. So we get Martin V. And I'm running out of space on my slide now for all these popes. But so at this point, the cardinals say, Martin V is now the pope. Everybody else is not pope. And happily, the Holy Roman Empire pope goes away, and so does the pope in Rome. But the French pope is like, no, I am still pope. Benedict XIII, pope in Avignon forever. And nobody cares at this point. Like, Europe is so done with popes. So finally it is resolved, Martin V becomes the real pope, all the rest are considered anti-popes. Historically speaking, like the Vatican now recognizes the line of Urban VI, all the Roman popes as being true popes and all of the other popes as being anti-popes, but that's like retroactive. And studying this particular history is especially messy because there was totally a John the 22nd at one point, and like we had a John the 22nd, like He was Pope John Paul, and I was alive during his papacy. It's, yeah, a giant mess. So at any rate, this is the outcome. Now we've got one pope. Hooray, everything's back to normal, except the damage has been done. And people really don't take the papacy all that seriously anymore. So we see two major reform movements springing out of this whole process, fighting back against the ugly mess that is the papacy and Catholicism at this moment. First, we get John Wycliffe. He's a British guy, and he has some fairly nasty things to say about the way that Christianity and power work. Specifically, his argument is that legitimate rulers follow the model of Christ, the big capital L, capital R ruler, the king of all of us, and that means not accumulation of power, accumulation of wealth, like execution of power over anyone they can, but rather being a servant, which sounds pretty good, unless you happen to be ruling at the time. The other thing that Wycliffe pushes for is we want to translate the Bible into vernacular languages. Let's take all of that theological study out of this sort of elitist clergy situation. Let's stop using Jerome's Latin Bible and instead start translating the Bible into English or German or French or whatever language you're speaking at this point in time, which, again, as Protestants, we should be fairly sympathetic toward. I mean, even Catholicism at this point has moved to the vernacular languages at long last. But this also doesn't go over well. And as a result, at the Council of Constance, the same one that elected Martin V, John Wycliffe is posthumously condemned and excommunicated from the church. They take his body out of the place where he is buried in the cathedral at Canterbury, and they just chuck it in the Thames, and he just flows down into the ocean and does not receive his Christian burial. Again, retroactively. I also have one note here which is completely wrong. I am apologizing for that. I built this PowerPoint in a hurry. So let's talk about Jan Hus. Hus very much followed John Wycliffe's thinking. He really likes this idea of translating the Bible into their own language. Jan Hus is Czech. The Czechs are hanging around in what is known as Bohemia at this point in time. They're neighbors to the Bulgarians, to the Habsburgs, and to the Holy Roman Empire. They're like kind of part of the Holy Roman Empire at this point in time, but they don't identify with them. And Hus stressing that, again, Christ should totally be the model for rulers, and we should not be accumulating power. Real rule is service. That inspires all the Czechs to rise up against the church, against the Holy Roman Emperor, against all the political forces in play. So these Czech nationalists just grab Jan Hus's thinking and they run with it. And Jan Hus actually does come up with his own translation of the Bible between all of the things going on. So this is one of the first works of the Bible into a vernacular language. So to confront this particular schism that seems to be happening, Hus is also invited to the Council of Constance, where we're going to talk about Martin V. But it's a trap! As soon as he gets there, they arrest him, they condemn him, they defrock him in public, like they rip off his clothes, and they burn him at the stake. They do not mess around at this point. Remember, we have the Inquisition going on now, so we are not tolerating these infractions. But weirdly, the Czechs just get mad. So the revolution continues, and it is very successful. Like, the papacy throws crusade after crusade against them, and the Czechs just keep fighting them off. And then finally, the church just like strikes a peace. Like, all right, you do church your way, we're going to do church our way, and let's just not talk about it anymore, because this is such a big deal. But what I want to stress is that this is the beginning of the Reformation. This is where change is starting to take place. People are sick and tired of Catholic politics, of popes and anti-popes, and popes being under the thumb of French rulers, and popes like executing their unquestioned will against people. This is where change is happening. And as much as we as Protestants are like, yeah, Protestantism, finally, like everything's gonna be great now. No. It's going to be hundreds of years before anything becomes even remotely great. The first things we're going to be talking about are theologians talking theology and the wars that happen as a result. It is going to be violent, it is going to be ugly, it is going to be like selfishly motivated in many cases. It's going to be a giant mess. But if there's anything to take away from this whole grand, like 9-week process that we've sort of walked through, And history really doesn't yield like great, easy, nicely packaged morals. It's that power and Christianity don't mix. When they do, no matter what form it takes, it tends to be ugly. And that's not like it's always ugly. There have been good popes wielding power in good ways. There have been opportunities for the Christians to stand up and do awesome things, and they have frequently taken them. It has also been a giant mess. Stuff like the Crusades, stuff like the Inquisition, stuff like various monks getting into big brawls, or all of our Greek Orthodox scholars having fights over monophysitism, or everybody basically not being able to agree on how God works because of the translation issues between Latin and Greek. It's a mess. And when that mess starts to seriously influence people's lives, it gets even messier, even faster. So, I don't have an answer. Like, we obviously have more history to talk about, and even if we do get to the present, we're not gonna have a moral because, we're right in the thick of it, like, history keeps on going. But I want this to sort of be in the back of your mind. We, by nature, have a certain amount of power as Christians, like as individual Christians, as Christians in a church, as Christians as a body with all other Christians everywhere. We have power just by sheer force of numbers, by the sheer strength of our voice, by all of the historical credibility that we have gotten. How are we using it? Because that's key at the end of the day. How do we use the power that we have? Are we using it to live the model that Christ gave us? Or are we using it to just get more power, accumulate more wealth? Are we doing it to protect and preserve what we think is right and ourselves in that place? Guys like Wycliffe, I think, have the right idea. Guys like the monks, who gave up all of their wealth and all of their power for the sake of what they believed was right. I think they had the right idea. I think Christianity thrives most when it gives up power, or when it is resisting the powers in place, rather than when it assumes power to itself, when it claims authority for itself. So just keep that in mind. Any questions before we dismiss? Because I know that, this is it, folks. June?
I just have one, I think I missed it. When you were talking about the Czech National Rebellion?
Yes.
Was that against Czech or the papacy?
Against the papacy and against the Holy Roman Empire, which were largely viewed as one and the same thing to the Czechs.
Okay.
At this point, like I said, nations are starting to spring out of this giant European mess. Like we have France is now France, and everybody identifies as French. And the British are British, and everybody identifies as English. We have, the Spanish are Spanish, and everybody identifies as Spanish. The Holy Roman Empire doesn't have this. They are not Germans at this point. That won't be until the 19th century. We've got a long road before they have a national identity. At this point, they are still a bunch of petty lords and a bunch of petty fiefs all fighting one another. Which means that you've got people like the Habsburg Austrians on the one hand hanging out in the Holy Roman Empire, and the Czechs on the other, and the Germans/Prussians on the other, and also some Italians and some French and some clerical authorities. It's a giant mess. So the Czechs are pushing against the Holy Roman Emperor because they don't see him as representing their ideas the same way that the French see the French king as representative of them. So that's a lot of the thinking here. And to this day, that part of the world is tough. Germany itself is very much fractured between the South Germans and Bavaria on the one hand and the North Germans and so on. There's a lot of factionalism even now when we identify them as a nation, powerful and self-identified. Other questions? All right, but I have taken way too much time, and let's call it for today. Thank you for bearing with me for as long as we have. I know this was a long,
Well done, sir.